looks like in TV. We have Nick Cavett, who's the Associate Partner of Digital Strategy at VSA Partners. He works with clients like Beam Suntory, Nike, and Marvin Windows. He's been, previously he was a digital strategist at 360i and VML. Please welcome Nick and the panel.
Good morning, everybody. First, I want to thank MediaPost and thank our two guests here for attending. I think sitting in on this morning's sessions, measurement is definitely the buzzword and critical to the buy side, the sell side, the publisher side, and really understanding what the future holds for television. And so I kind of want to just start off by, since you guys aren't on the buy side or the sell side, but you're really on the research and insight side, get a sense for you guys of where we are in the world today. How far along do you think we are in the maturity model, and what are the type of engagements that you are seeing come across your desks? And Jeff, if you don't mind, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. I'm Jeff Boehm from ComScore, and a little background about me and a little bit about the company. ComScore is a new company. We recently just completed our merger with Rentrack from where I came from, and before that, Rentrack merged with Cantor Media North America, where I came from. And so I've been now with 3 companies in about a year and a half. Prior to that, with Nielsen, heading up their advanced television group, and then heading up research and marketing for NCC Media, and then with NBC way back when, as well as ABC, and of course, as I said, with NCC Media. So my background has always been in research, mostly on the television side of research, and now it's really interesting to see that landscape. And the comments that I would make is that, measurement isn't the buzzword, it is essential. And without measurement, you can't monetize anything. And the key is, how do you manage the measurement? So if I looked at the landscape today, and right after the merger, I probably have the best seat in the house to see what's going on in media. Because what we do is work with all sides of the media ecosystem, from agencies to networks, TV stations, publishers, and you can imagine the internal conversations about how we measure various things. Why? Because we have the collision of 2 worlds, the digital side, and then we have, let's say, the traditional television side, all of which are quite different, with different metrics of accountability and value. And the challenge for ComScore right now is, how do we put that together in a comprehensive way so that you can monetize that media in ways that make sense? So the quick answer to your question, where are we? We are right at the beginning, because every time you turn around, as we talked about with OTT, raise your hand if you think OTT is being measured properly right now. Don't see any hands. I would argue, how many think that we're measuring television well right now, traditional television? Right? Kind of, sort of, yeah, sort of. And the reason why I say I have the best seat in the house is that I see from our client's perspective now what they need. And what they need from the agency side, from the media side, is now coming to a thinner path. And what our role at ComScore, my particular role heading up the television research side, is now to put the dots together so that people can really understand a couple of basic things. One, how do we understand now the media value, but defined by various things? And I can tell you that the immediate movement that's moving right now is the direction from a specific age, gender, into real consumer metrics. And that's the value statement, because it's really important to know what kind of audience you have based on its consumer values, such as age and gender. All important. But what really is more important, from an advertising point of view, was it effective? Did the campaign work? Are there better ways to do it? Can you involve the client on more serious and monetary discussions in terms of efficiencies, effectiveness? And now we see the explosion of various media. We saw some of them before, and our company measures the addressable. We measure the linear. We measure the mobile. We measure a lot of different things. The question is, how do you put it together in a comprehensive way? And our biggest challenge and part of the fun after all of these years is to put it together in a comprehensive way so that our clients can really understand the value and work both sides of that ecosystem.
Thank you.
Brian Hughes. I run the audience intelligence practice at Magna, which is the centralized investment, innovation, and intelligence unit of IPG Media Brands. If anybody wants me to explain that better, I'll do so offline. But as far as where we are, I agree with Jeff. I think we're at the beginning, and yet I find myself wishing we were at least at the middle.
And so I think it's interesting because, you know, we're at the beginning, but we're coming at a time where there's a lot of penetration in terms of devices. The mobile movement happened, the programmatic movement happened in digital. And so I'm curious to kind of get a sense from you guys what type of impact that you guys anticipate over the coming years in terms of accountability. So I spent a lot of time doing digital marketing, display advertising, and the industry did very well and continues to do very well, and clients never even thought to ask about viewability, not realizing that people weren't scrolling down or their ads weren't seen, and then all of a sudden that's a very important metric. So I'm curious to hear from you guys, you know, how much is OTT programmatic being, how closely is it being looked at? Is back of the envelope math sufficient for clients right now? Do you have people who are really interrogating it or looking to interrogate it in the way that digital is interrogated? Or what are you kind of seeing out there?
Number one, the accountability is critical. As I said before, the first role of measurement is to really help to monetize it to make money. The second is to keep making money with it. And the only way to do that is to prove your accountability. So we're very proud at the ComScore side because we were the first, you know, with MRC accreditation to actually have viewability accredited as part of the metrics. From the television side, we have started our second audit with the MRC. So if you're not familiar with the MRC, the Media Rating Council, please get familiar with the work that they're doing because we have a lot of different associations in the media world. And they're all doing some really, really great work. I would say that the MRC now is branching out to all of them to try to not manage all of these standards, but really to help define what some requirements and guidelines are. You know, there's a great quote from, you know, the pirate movies where, you know, it's not rules, but they're guidelines, and we're kind of there. The other thing I would say is that when we are at the beginning, this is not new. So if you go back, and I hate to date myself, but if you go back even when Nielsen introduced people meters in 1987, it was new because they were seeing competition from across the seas with AGB, which then became Kantar Media. And we're looking at the television gold system, from what people say, based on 1987 technology. So everything is new again. Why? Because every time a new program comes on or a new delivery platform comes on, you have to figure out how to measure it. And again, I would argue that that's part of the fun of what we do in the media is to try to determine, if you like bells and whistles, what's the best way to create content and to deliver content across various streams. Now because of digital devices, and this is really critical, what we see in our company and what I think stands us apart and what I've been fighting for 20 years is return path data. Why? Because return path data from digital devices are telling you without managing separate panels, huge, massive usage data sets. And that's driving a lot of these metrics that we're seeing today. So, you know, to answer your question, I think looking at these metrics from these devices, but understand how to interpret them is even more critical. You can have billions of data points. If you don't know what it means and you don't know how to manage it, it will actually hurt your business.
Yeah, I agree. I've always said that more data isn't necessarily better data, and I think, you know, having large sets like set-top box data is very helpful. And obviously, I don't believe that panels alone are going to be sufficient anymore going forward. But I also think that they do have their place. As far as OTT and you know, advanced TV in our organization, I feel like we've actually done a pretty good job evangelizing it. That's kind of part of the role that Magna plays. And we've had a decent sort of cross-section of clients that have at least tried one or both out to see, but obviously measurement is a challenge, and giving them sort of metrics that they're comfortable with.
And so I'm wondering if you guys can maybe share any insight that you've had around, what metrics are we feeling good about today? What are the metrics that clients are asking for that we are able to deliver standpoint? What are the things that you think should be measured in terms of all the data that's potentially available? And then what are the things that are potentially farther out or dependencies for us?
From the sort of real high-level view, the one thing that my team is very interested in is time. So how people spend their time, because in our opinion, there isn't any more time to spend on media. So at this point, it's really just going to be a shift between media in terms of how people spend their time. So it's something that we look at a lot. We haven't to date had a holistic way to see video time spent across by each individual platform. And so we've kind of done our best to try and estimate it ourselves, and hope that the measurement will catch up and allow us to refine those estimates going forward. In terms of campaign level stuff, I think we're very focused on impressions. We've converted our local TV buying, for example, to impressions as opposed to ratings, because we just thought it made a lot more sense. And I think it's a metric that has always existed in both digital and TV, and so I think it's easy to translate. And I know that there is a certain comfort level with GRPs in terms of being the TV metric that a lot of clients are used to, but my argument against that has always been we should be trying to make TV more like digital and not the other way around.
And do you get a sense that that's happening, or do you find clients continuing to want to seeing things rolled back into GRPs or in things they're more familiar with?
I haven't encountered that much myself in terms of clients wanting to see GRPs. In terms of is it happening, TV becoming more like digital? Yes, it's inevitable that it will. So we may as well sort of try and get the metrics aligned now. And
so, I think some of these the new formats for media in television, whether it's they offer new media formats, and so whether it's or cost per completed view or skippable content, interactive. I'm an Apple TV user. I actually just got served my first Papa John's YouTube video, which was a direct call to download the app. So
you're welcome.
There you go. And so, the excitement around video the excitement around the future of OTT. I mean, you can see it right there, especially when you think about audiences that are really well aligned for live sports and that type of thing. But what kind of impact is that having on measurement, or what type of mixes are you seeing on the media ad unit side today? Do you see people really craving to kind of go to a more interactive form or more skippable content, or is pre-roll kind of the mainstay in terms of mix?
I think it depends. I mean, Google is a huge partner of ours, so we definitely play in both the TrueView skippable space as well as pre-roll, and we're exploring other sort of newer options with them as well. So I think it depends on the client and what their needs are. In terms of OTT, I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity for interactivity, and it's by nature sort of what we say is it's kind of like TV without the clutter. So you have the opportunity to have your ad or your message or your content sort of appear in a space that's generally uncluttered, and often right before someone's going to go watch something that's not ad supported at all. So.
And so it's interesting that you mentioned Google, because I'm curious to know, obviously given the large footprint that the Googles, Facebooks, Twitters of the world have as kind of walled gardens. Jeff, maybe this is a good question for you. What impact do you see them having, and role do you see them playing in terms of either through developing guidelines or, Facebook famously eschewed, IAB standards and created their own ad unit and kind of customer first in that sense. What do you think is the role that plays? Is it good for the industry as a whole? Does it present challenges?
I have two sides to it. The first I would caution is caveat emptor, because we are seeing more and more private marketplaces, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it actually is a good thing. And for our company, we actually help propel it. We propel it because we provide the third-party measurement. And I'll go back to what I was saying before. There's a value definition that needs to be established with guidelines, standards, and ultimately rules. The question is, where are we with that? And the real issue is those private marketplaces are going to thrive. And they're going to thrive because of the digital ecosystem. These platforms are going to enable different kinds of advertising that we really haven't seen before. It was breakthrough advertising when we helped launch at Cantor Media DirecTV Advanced Advertising. And it was really terrific, where all of a sudden an ad can be beamed down from a satellite to be resident on somebody's DVR and fire in place of a normal ad. Why? So that it became more, quote unquote, targeted. It was more relevant. And we saw studies, we've done studies at Cantor that actually showed that they were a lot more effective. Now, are those metrics for that currency available everywhere? No, it's not. So DirecTV, now Dish with the merger, we're working with all of the MVPDs on their addressable, just to use this as an example. These are walled garden types of effective advertising. The question is it scalable? Because that's what advertisers ultimately look for, because it's great that you can get the Dish footprint of maybe 14, 15 million or DirecTV. That's great, but most national advertisers want more. So how do you collectively put it together in a way that makes sense with the technology doesn't necessarily fit the same way? So there's a lot of technical and I would say engineering solutions that have been created, but the measurement follows right on top of it. The walled garden, these what I would call the private marketplaces, should thrive because they are going to bring value, whereas maybe it didn't. And for various advertisers, it may make sense. But the measurement has to be, number one, transparent. It has to be available to both parties so that it can be judged. And that's what we're trying to provide, both syndicated as well as custom solutions, because that's what's really driving the marketplace.
Brian, thank you very much. Brian, did you have anything to add?
As far as the walled gardens, I mean, I think the strategy that we've tried to take is fewer, bigger, better. So in other words, choosing specific partners that we think are the best for our clients and trying to kind of double down with them and not spread the money across so many.
I think, if I may, Brian's point is important because the amount of time involved is enormous. It's enormous. So what's really critical is to see which are the best opportunities and take advantage of those with the best standards that you have. Doesn't mean that there won't be a lot of them, but there's a gravitation to the mean, if you will. It's what's best, easiest, and most effective is really how things typically play out.
And I'm curious to know, what you mentioned. We talked a lot about how there's a lot of data out there, and you don't necessarily want to measure everything. You want to measure the right thing, and fewer, bigger, better. Do you guys have a point of view in terms of what it takes to put together a good team on the analysis side in order to really yield insights? I mean, I would add, in addition to kind of drawing a line towards return on marketing investment, measurement also affords you the opportunity to kind of point your targeting in the right direction. And part and parcel with that is really having a dynamic kind of relationship with your measurement partner. And so I'm curious to know, does this shift the kind of, we've heard about weekly optimizations, and so does this kind of change the model a bit and from the quarterly report or the monthly report of what you might get, and what kind of things you guys how are you working with clients today to address that?
I think it's getting better, but I think a lot of the stuff is frustratingly delayed in terms of the data that we want to get and be able to react to quickly. So I mean, that's definitely been a challenge because a lot of the syndicated type stuff comes in on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis, and it's hard to sort of use that. I mean, we can use it looking forward, but we want to be able to react more in real time.
Yeah, I would concur. Because one of the challenges we have at ComScore is getting the data out as fast as we can. And right now, a lot of our data sets aren't available till maybe 3 days after the fact. In television, maybe a week, a month after the fact. And that's frustrating because when we start looking at the data sets, in terms of the collection, the processing, the quality assurance, that all takes time. So the caution here is to make sure that you're looking at the right data in the right way, because it's very easy to take a data set and pump it out the next day. It's very easy to take a look at information and make quick decisions on it. Right now, we're trying to be as cautious as we can, which is why we're seeing those data sets. But again, everybody, right now, you have to have your phone right next to you because you want to have instant access to everything. And our businesses are following that same trend, and we have to discipline ourselves to make sure we have it right first before it gets out into the marketplace, because we wouldn't want, say, you as a client to make bad decisions based on bad data. That, to us just, is destructive.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance because again, you don't want it to be wrong, but you still want it fast, and yeah, I guess it's sometimes obviously it's hugely complex and there's nothing we can really do about it. But I guess sometimes it seems like with technology being what it is, we should be able to do this faster.
Yeah, I agree.
And so maybe you could share some examples with the group in terms of where you're seeing it kind of really working well in terms of being able to get the data out there and react, and insights that you may have drawn from some client work. I know you had mentioned you had done some work with GroupM a while back or earlier this year.
Yeah, and I won't take up too much time. I'd be happy to discuss more details afterwards. But all of the 5 families of agencies are subscribing to a lot of our different data, and I've got the privilege.
I like the analogy to the mafia crime families. Yeah.
Fitting venue
I've
for
never
it.
said the mafia, but what's really fun is actually looking at the data and understanding how they want to use it. So, for example, if you go on the ARF website, I had the privilege with GroupM to present on behalf of their client how they were using our data to identify specific users of shampoo. So if you go on the website, you can actually see what we were able to do is to first identify from their perspective who their specific consumer was. We tracked their behavior, we tracked the ads, and then we were able to understand whether or not there was a lift in purchasing. And it actually does work. So if you can control and identify how they place their advertising, and the simple concept was, how do we move from, let's say, women 18 to 49 to people who actually buy their products, then you can actually see how media works. Now, the interesting part of that is taking a look at the data sets, getting the cooperation of the client, because the massive data set is what drives it. It was great. 20 years ago, we talked about indexing and how well that works, but it never became part of the transactional side of the business because you didn't have enough sample size to do it. Well, now when you have 22 million households in the United States that we have for, say, television, then we can actually start not fusing data sets, but matching data sets, so we can actually see the behavior and we can actually see the purchase behavior. And for companies like the companies that we deal with, we're working on those kind of aspects all the time. That's exciting stuff because it's moving the needle by making media placed better by the intelligence of the data that drive it.
We recently did a study with Hulu for some clients, and it was cross-platform, and what we found, it was the first time we were able to include OTT in a comprehensive way. And what we found was very complementary. So OTT, for example, we found was very good for brand awareness and likability, whereas mobile was better for purchase intent. And although I can't prove causality, that made a lot of sense to me because I feel like your phone is most likely to be with you further down the funnel, and use it sort of up until the last minute to kind of price compare and check reviews of different products and so forth. And then the other thing we found that I thought was interesting was, obviously frequency and frequency capping is a big concern. And we found that, for longer campaigns, the average your exposures such that you maintain all those brand metrics at a high level that you want to see, but you don't lose too much. So kind of maintaining that top of mind for the consumer without overwhelming them.
Great. I have one more question. I think then we're gonna maybe open it up to some Q&A here. What is the most difficult problem to be solved in terms of measurement today? We've heard about individuals versus households, measuring through to conversion. what are the, and maybe we can actually share, what are the things that are most exciting, closest to solving for, and then what are the things that we think are maybe farther away from your perspectives?
I mean, I would point out too, actually, I think it's finding a balance, right, between the sort of having standards and having, vetted sort of third-party measurement that, that we want, that's neutral, but also recognizing, and I brought this up yesterday, that we might necessarily need a single currency anymore. That, that as we want to get more granular and get closer to our specific consumer targets, that, one sort of single metric might not be enough anymore. And the other thing I would point out is infrastructure, and I think this came up yesterday too, is that right now, the ability to transact on these types of targets is very limited just because of the legacy, buy-sell systems, and that's, a challenge.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. How about?
I would agree. I think there are multiple currencies. We call them baskets of currencies because that's what the world is going to work with now. Similarly, if you look at the issues going on with Brexit, or as you mentioned earlier, we're not on the metric system, and a lot of the world is, and it works. But you have to convert things, and it's timely. It's timely. So how do you manage those expectations? The other key point is, I think, look at the emergence of the data scientist. And I couldn't be happier about the emergence of data scientists, but the data scientists aren't the researchers, and there's a big, big difference. But I see a wonderful collaboration if done right, because I've seen a lot of companies gravitate towards data science, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to get you what you need. And you need the media researcher that is actually going to be, I think, essential in the process to understand what the context, what the meaning, and the evaluation is all about. Those are going to be, I think, some really critical things.
I agree, and it's not just because I want to keep my job.
Okay, so do we want to maybe turn it over to some folks for questions?
Tim Ware from Tremor Video. This is out of left field, but what is your point of view on the automatic content recognition, the measurement of the glass, enabling us to get out of the set-top box walled garden panelish world?
I mean, I think I would hope that the future is some kind of hybrid measurement in which all of it is somehow taken into account to make the best judgment possible. I mean, the one concern with that type of thing now is I think it is a bit biased towards who connected TVs, and they're a little bit different than, say, the average person and with an MVPD subscription. But over time, I think more or less every TV sold these days has connectivity. So over time, it will get more integrated and hopefully become part of how we track people's behavior.
Yeah, I would agree. I think anything that you can automatically measure well makes a heck of a lot of sense. Whether or not it's a set-top box or a television set, because most of our data today comes from a set-top box, as you folks probably know. But we don't call it set-top box anymore because we're measuring things from phones and platforms and everything else. So we're not tied to a set-top box. And if we can automatically recognize the content coming across the screen, either ad or program, and we can do that fast, because if we can then understand what that content is quickly, associate with an audience, that would be great. The hard part is making sure that the technology, number one, works across all different devices. Second thing is, who owns that? Because is it a commonplace metric or system that everybody can access? And this conversation, as you know, has been probably going on about 10 years in terms of how do you define and how do you manage that process? But the concept, I think, is clearly good.
Joe Mandisi from MediaPost. So Brian, I think it's interesting that you're moving to time-based metrics. I think that's a smart move. I think your insight that there's a fixed amount of time available for people to consume media is a keen insight. I think moving to impressions from ratings makes sense, but I think it's actually a contradiction of sorts. And shouldn't you be moving to some form of ratings that account for the time people spend with media? And a related question for Jeff. You're moving to a total household sample soon, and I think there's a TV meter in there. Are you starting to think about how you could compute ratings of the time people spend with media across all these different platforms that you're measuring?
People interact so with each devices. I may look at my phone for 45 seconds, and how do you sort of compile that together? I mean, I think there can be both, so we can have impressions in terms of knowing how many people we reached, but also understood how much time they spent and whether or not they sort of completed looking at the ad or interacted in some way.
And we have two new metrics that they're not really new, but we've started to use more and more with all our clients. It's how long you're spending media, and then how much you're actually buying things, and look at those correlations. You could that are coming in. So now that you have the data sets, now that you have the knowledge base, and you have the experience, but more importantly, you have the need to be able to understand what the consumers are doing, now you can do those things. Joe referenced our total home panel. So by the end of this year, we'll have 10,000. If you haven't heard about it, be happy to talk about it or send you some information. We've got 10,000 homes that have agreed to digitally connect all of their devices within the household. So you sit there and go, that's kind of scary because every digital device, and if you think refrigerator or everything else, the household agrees, and we can actually see the time spent with all the different devices. Then we drill down to find out what the content was. But very, very clearly, it's how long and how much are becoming extraordinarily relevant, because then with our data scientists, we can connect the dots to see what the relevance is between the content and the actual usage.
Like the measurement of quality of media and the idea of currency. And measurement and currency are starting to either be confused or conflated. I'm not sure in the right way. Like currency implies a value. The value comes from a measurement that tells us this is of high quality or it has the impact that we're looking for. Mm-hmm. It sounds like y'all talk a lot about the metrics, with which we would buy something, which seems to be a currency, but we're not talking about the performance of that media for a particular objective like brand awareness, and how are we using that measurement of brand awareness to influence the value of that metric and dictate what the currency is.
I think you bring up a good point, because from a research point of view, there's things that you really want to know about your content or about your consumer or about your brand. I can tell you, though, a lot of the data we're using now had been catapulted into currency. So for example, if we look at what Viacom networks are doing, for the upfronts, they're actually utilizing the data and saying, we are now going to look at different measures, different metrics, and they're placing not just the buys on it, but they're guaranteeing on it. And that, I think, is the distinction of the currency. It's, you can look at research data, you can look at profiles. The real question comes down to, what are you transacting on between buyer and seller? For us, that's the currency. So what we have seen, GroupM started planning currency 2 years ago in the upfronts. Now, they still executed on traditional metrics such as age, gender, but what they did was they reconfigured their buys. So they were looking at, say, on the network side, whether or not of 250 networks, does History Channel score well against one of their products? If you looked at age, gender, no. If you looked at the match data with Shopcom, yes. So in terms of allocation, they were now included on the buy. Transacted still on traditional, but in terms of the decision there. But other companies like Viacom, now like Fox, they are now looking at the data differently and are transacting on it, which that's currency.
Yeah, I mean, we've done very similar things, sort of plan using the more granular metric, and then still transact on Nielsen, sort of having to explain that, like, listen, maybe this rating doesn't look so good for women 25 to 54, but we clearly hit your car purchase target very well, so your effective CPM is actually really good, even though it may not look great in the traditional way.
Nick, we're gonna extend this into our roundtable in about half an hour. Nick, guys, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're out the morning by sort of teasing out something that Oleg mentioned this morning. Garza, who actually came up with the concept for this panel that we're pursuing. Ross, take it away.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thanks. Welcome to Middlemen TV. I'd like to start my panelists here to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what they do and who they work for, of course. Sorry, go ahead.
Sure. Oscar Garza, and I head up programmatic globally for Essence.
Walt Horseman, Audience Express. We are a programmatic TV platform, so we automate the planning, buying, execution of TV. Walt Horseman, Audience Express. We are a programmatic TV platform, so we automate the planning, buying, execution, optimization of linear television and apply the advanced data sets that the prior panel talked about.
Great. So a couple of the panel descriptions today have mentioned TV 2.0. So I know we've been talking a lot about what that might mean here. So I'll ask you guys to start by just giving us a little overview of what we're talking about today. TV 2.0, sort of what does it include, in your opinion?
Lively discussion about this yesterday in the roundtables, talking about programmatic TV, and programmatic being sort of a poor term. I'm a programmatic guy, and I'm saying that. Programmatic being a poor term for what we're trying to describe here, and sort of what I'm seeing as sort of three categories within television: is the automation of linear, your addressable category of which I think is the most interesting, and then finally your connected devices, which could be shared between addressable and the connected device could share a sort of digital identity.
Yeah, I would say if you think about programmatic TV 1.0, it was very focused on basic automation, the use of the existing data sets, third-party data sets that have come to fore in the past couple of years. I think we're going to start seeing in 2.0, from just the tech perspective, greater and greater automation. Ultimately, our goal is to make buying a TV campaign as easy as buying a book on Amazon. I think we are going to get there. We're going to simplify this, make it easier. And then greater and more sophisticated data sets, first-party data, CRM data being applied to television campaigns. I think all of that is going to get more sophisticated, more targeted, bigger data sets so that the media placement can be more specific and more effective. And I think another, separate from all of that, a very important part of programmatic TV 2.0 is greater trust and credibility. I think whenever one of these industries starts to come, there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of folks jumping in, there's a lot of confusion, and in the 2.0 world, we will have greater trust, greater credibility, greater information that will benefit the entire ecosystem from the agencies all the way to the publishers and the inventory holders.
Great, that sounds great. So today, Oscar, can you tell us or describe for us maybe a typical campaign, how many third parties are involved, what they each do specifically?
Yeah, I think Jared had a good, diagram he put up earlier, talking about the different players. And right now, it's feeling pretty simple. We have this sort of direct connection to the providers, to the operators. DSPs are a little bit, playing a sort of clearinghouse, function. And I think that this is what it looked like 10 years ago in programmatic, that you were able to kind of connect from here to the inventory source pretty quickly. People saw opportunity. People saw an opportunity to make money by seeing what a byproduct of some of the media buys were doing in terms of spawning data or aggregating inventory sources and things of that nature. So I think we're at the beginning of what of the sort of journey between like what we had in kind of your typical display digital. So do we take the opportunity now to set some standards or create that transparency so that we don't have potentially as much of a mess as we seem to have in digital?
Right. So how many middlemen can be involved, and how many should be involved, in your opinion?
It can be. I mean, if you look at the sort of digital display ecosystem now, you can have an impression pass through a dozen different entities between publisher and when it finally gets to you. And it's what's happening is that the publishers are seeing 20% of the bid at best, and that's not good. I think that publishers need to be, and the only way to do that is to have the visibility, so that as an agency and the advert, I can share with my clients, hey, this is what's happening with your impression. These are the people that are sort of interrupting it and not adding value potentially, or they are adding value, and we get to negotiate what the kind of cost cut is. But right now, I get to negotiate with my DSP. I get to bid for an impression in the open exchange if we keep it really basic, but I don't get to negotiate the, 1 or 2 points that happen between this entity and that all the way through the supply chain.
Right. So with that in mind, Walt, give us a sense of what a middleman's role is inside this TV 2.0 landscape, and what value does your company specifically bring to the table?
Well, middlemen are not bad. So I'll just put that up as a comment. And middlemen do provide value. You just have to understand, and it has to be very explicit in terms of what that value is. And it's incumbent upon agencies and advertisers to interrogate anyone who is a middleman to understand what is that explicit value that is being provided. So in the case of our company, we aggregate inventory across all of the MVPD telco satellite guys across the country and apply technology so that there is a direct connection to those inventory sources, and then it can be planned, executed, reported out daily so that an agency knows exactly what they're getting. They can see their impression delivery on a day-by-day basis. I think that in the digital world, I feel like, and I've never worked in the digital world, but sort of looking at it, from a distance, it seemed like there were so many middlemen who got into the space because it was a messy industry. Problems were created, more middlemen were created to fix those other problems, and so it just became this cycle of different currencies, different data sets, lots of negotiations across data and what everything meant, and Oscar is saying, it jumped through so many hoops. TV fundamentally is just a more structured, more structured media category in general. There are rules in place in terms of possible and there how the inventory access is a lot simpler, and so the TV industry will ultimately not have that many middlemen because it's just not necessary, because it's just a more structured industry to begin with.
I would caution. I think that what happened in digital was equal parts sort of opportunity, people going honestly to try to solve problems with some of maybe the lack of structure, but at the same time there were people that understood database and engineering, and we're seeing data in different ways for the first time, and people took the opportunity, or maybe exploited the opportunity, that the media buyers weren't versed in how a database works, and weren't versed in how technology moves from one way to another. I mean, even today, if you go to marketers and you say, hey, what's your team staff like? We made the kind of mention about the resources moving from the CTO to the CMO, but if you don't staff ETL engineers on your marketing teams, if you don't have people that understand SQL at basic, you're going to be running into problems down the line. And I think it's more structured, certainly, with access to the source, and the formats are somewhat finite, but I think with development, with people trying to exploit some of the corners, we could see problems.
Great. Oscar, would you agree with the following statement? I get what I get for from the 30s I work with.
Yeah, right now it's a pretty limited set. Like I said, we have a pretty close, connection between the buying forms we're using or the resources. Right now it's fine, but I think that like I said, as people attempt to exploit opportunity, we could see a change in that over time.
I'm sorry. Say that again.
That if people were to take the opportunity to exploit, we could see that change over time, where it becomes a little bit more clouded. Something we don't have in digital is the transparency into that path that the impression takes. Mm-hmm. And so for the people that operate, somewhere in the middle, Walt, breadcrumbing for that impression, if I understood every entity that the impression passed through from the original point to the consumer, then I can identify where problems are happening, and we can work on it together.
Great. All right, Walt, how can vendors ensure they're delivering on all their promises to clients? How can you avoid over-promising and under-delivering?
You got to be transparent. This is a key thing across this whole ecosystem, and being confident and explaining to an agency or a marketer exactly how everything has delivered, how everything is run, providing excellent reporting. I mean, the devil is in the details in a lot of in the media industry, of course, and so having reporting that is verified by a third party is critical, and being upfront about educating exactly what you do as an intermediary in the ecosystem, and have your client ask tough questions. I mean, it is also incumbent upon agencies and advertisers. I mean, Oscar, as you're saying, yes, some of this stuff does get complicated. Some of it does require some technical prowess, but it is incumbent upon the agencies and on behalf of their marketers to be able to stand in front of them and say, this is the report of how your campaign ran, regardless of what media it ran on, and I can feel confident that this is exactly what happened in every step of the way, and I stand by that, because that is what is going to ensure that we have confidence and that we are delivering on what we say we're delivering on. I mean, look, I feel like this industry last year and even in the beginning of this year, especially in the digital world, has suffered from a crisis of confidence in the digital world, with viewability and lack of transparency, and too many passing the buck and saying, well, I'm telling my client that this is what happened because my DSP told me that this is what happened, and the DSP told me what happened because they were told that the DMP was that's what happened. And so you got so many people sort of saying, well, this person told me that this is what happened, and so therefore I believe them. And unfortunately, that makes everybody going all the way to the agency and the marketer feel a little less confident about really what's going on. And so we've got to interrogate the systems. We've got to have confidence to stand in front of clients and say, I know exactly where your dollars were spent and how they flowed all the way through, and I feel confident that this report is fully accurate and vetted.
I agree, and as an agency, I'll raise my hand and say it's our responsibility to do that interrogation and to develop the skill set, develop the knowledge, teach the clients, and also bring our kind of good partners along and say, hey, look, you're doing a good job. Let's shine the light in the dark corners of the internet here. We talked about the ownership of this sort of TV 2.0 buy between the digital agency and the traditional agency. We're doing some testing only so that we can provide a recommendation that is good enough, different enough in terms of measurement and accountability before we ask to take those dollars away from the TV agencies, basically.
So you started to talk about the similarities and differences between programmatic display and programmatic TV, as we're calling it. Do we think they're going down similar paths or not? And what's similar and different about
I mean, I think we'd like to see the sort of, I think Oleg mentioned there's like addressability and automation, right? Those are the things that we're kind of looking for. And it doesn't necessarily have to be real-time bidded, although that would be very interesting to have down the line. I think there's some of the inventory sources that are probably never going to be real-time bidded because of this kind of traditional structure they have in place, and it's just not going to move that far. But we would like to have ultimate control over like buying the impressions that we want, because the impressions that we want reach the consumers that we want, and we want to reach them enough times to change their mind about something or to convince them to buy our products.
Yeah, I think programmatic should take friction out of the workflow. It ought to make buying and monitoring, optimizing a campaign simpler. And I think there's a lot of similarities in terms of having easy to use UIs that sit on a desktop for an agency to execute campaigns in a really simple, transparent way is a common similarity between all of them. I mean, as we talk about OTT and we talk about video on demand, and we talk about emerging types of media. I mean, the role of the agency is just getting incredibly complex. And the role for an ad tech company or an intermediary ought to be make life simpler for an agency and increase value then for the inventory providers.
What can clients and agencies do to prevent programmatic from the same sort of pitfalls we've seen with programmatic delay? How can programmatic TV be more transparent and more accountable?
It's education and developing the right skill set. Like I said, we've digital agency, but we're staffing like so many software people, people with software backgrounds to come and work in things like programmatic and media, because we need to understand how software works, how data is moved between sources, and that's what, like, if you understand those basic mechanics, you can see where points of exploitation, or you can understand how a vendor is generating data, and you can oftentimes call them on it.
Walt, who are you talking with more these days? TV side agency folks or digital folks?
Both. So we talk to a range of folks in the agency community, because depending on the agency and how they're structured, determine who is actually in charge of in television. It could come from folks who are working in the digital video world, who are now adding in traditional linear television. It can be traditional linear television buyers who say, look, we need to make television a better product, so we want to add all this data. We want to have in-campaign optimization. So that's the short answer. When I look at in terms of our 2016 activity, I would say about a third of it is from digital video, more digitally centric folks, and about 2/3 from traditional TV media planners and buyers.
Are you seeing the TV activity come mostly out of a desire for automation and making things a little bit simpler, or are there clients saying, hey, we should be in the TV 2.0 space? Like, where do you see the motivation?
I think we see a lot of traditional TV buyers who are saying, we need to get beyond just traditional Nielsen age and gender. We need to apply an advanced audience data set from a ComScore or first-party data or a Nielsen data set, so that they can go to their client and say, hey, here is a smarter TV campaign than what we've done historically. And I think that is a fantastic improvement for the TV ecosystem, because it starts to create a common vernacular between television and all of these other emerging media types.
So let's talk about the role of standardization. What role is that going to play in the evolution of TV into so-called 2.0?
I think there's just standardization is important. Like, we need to understand what the minimums are. In the previous panel talked about how some of those standards are being developed. In some cases, are good. Are not quite as good as we need them to be. Aligning on things like the currency, or what we actually transact on. If we're beyond the Nielsen ratings or the age and gender, can we get to an impression-based system, whether it be like seconds in view or something like that? Like, I think we need to decide what that looks like today or soon, so that can drive the discussion in the future. Because if we don't have like the same language,
Right.
then it's going to be hard to talk.
A lot of variables.
Yeah, I think standards are critical. I'm a huge fan of standards. And the reason why is we're seeing audiences shift from linear television to OTT to VOD, and we've got to make it easy, have some mechanism to plan, execute a cross-video campaign. And it's hard to do, because you've got one as a broadcast a distribution mechanism, and then another as a unicast distribution mechanism, and so the data are different. The traditional measures are different from the digital measures, but we really do have to solve this problem, and almost everybody in the industry seems to be working on various parts of it, but it really is critical, because that's going to give more of the credibility about how am I building a cross-platform campaign.
Great. So, all right, what kinds of middlemen will be necessary as TV evolves, and in your opinion, and what will be the characteristics of the middlemen who win?
I think there's going to be, things like data providers that will be adding value, hopefully, bringing you different audience segments. One of the things that we saw in digital is, I guess, a sort of innovation, but also the point of exploitation was the information we have about the impression generates metadata, and that metadata became useful after a time. It's like, oh, well, this is picking up location. Oh, why don't we take all the location from all the logs and turn that into a data set that we can sell? Fantastic. Now, it's a huge value add, obviously, but people do that enough times or with enough pieces of metadata gets reused, and it's it's too many people in the way. But I think you're going to see people enabling access to the inventory and doing some aggregation. You're going to have people offering data to enrich the buys that you're making and measurement.
I think it's technology. It's very much about if you are building technology which makes access to inventory easier, improves the value of inventory through better access, and streamline workflows to take people out of the ecosystem that are just dealing with what has historically been a system with a lot of friction in it. When companies who are tech companies that continuously add staff to their organizations, it always makes me kind of scratch my head and say, if you are a true tech company, you ought to have a highly scalable business so that as you grow, you are either maintaining the same headcount or even potentially reducing it, because you shouldn't have to keep adding more and more people into the ecosystem if the tech doing what it's doing.
All right, so last question for me before we go to the audience. I'd ask you to put on, to switch places. How would you approach the marketplace differently if you were in each other's shoes? What would you improve or change?
Feel free to be controversial.
Yeah. I mean, it comes back to this issue of really ask hard questions. Really get under the hood of any intermediary that you're working with and make them feel uncomfortable, Just drill in and interrogate and ask those hard questions. Because ultimately, if I'm putting myself in the shoes of the agency, I've got to stand in front of my client and say, I stand behind this. I chose to work with this partner, and that's ultimately my reputation. So ask the hard questions and make it a little uncomfortable that way, because that ultimately makes the ecosystem better. It makes everybody build a better offering.
I guess as an aggregator of inventory, I would hopefully provide the sort of visibility or transparency into the provenance of the inventory and the data so that we could have that conversation honestly.
Steve, question?
Questions? Well, put the agency hat back on again, and what question would you ask of the vendors?
Two things. One, just walk me through the workflow all the way through. Walk me through. I don't need to be an expert technologist, but just explain to me in layman's terms how all of this works. Not that many people. Listen, how an ad gets on air in various parts of the ecosystem is pretty complex. Just want to know exactly how it goes from an ad from my shop to getting on top box that's in Philadelphia. That would be one. The second would be, how are you using data? I have seen too many times where data is distorted in a post-campaign analysis where it is actually fit to whatever aired in the campaign to therefore make the campaign look like it did exactly what we intended it to do in the first place. It's done in a post-facto environment. So ask hard questions about what data sets are being used, how are you applying them, how are you measuring success of how those data sets translate in the delivery and outcome against the intended target.
Who puts the brakes on? Maybe this one is aimed a little bit more at Oscar. Who puts the brakes on here? There was nobody, when it came to the online supply chain, there was no, everybody seemed to be asleep at the IAB itself declares last year we screwed up as an industry and to some degree as an association. And I'm curious that within the TV industry, who do we to put the it? Well, I mean, it started out with the network breaks on, and we just there's a lot of pressure from below for that to happen.
Yeah, I'm not sure the breaks on either.
Not. Now we're eating there.
Agencies, certainly. I mean, any media buyer, right? Like, there's a lot of advertisers are going direct as well, and I think anybody who's trying to understand the impact of media in a very thorough way, they're going to ask the question to get all the way down to where this impression came from, where is it, where is it being paid for, and we ask for the workflow in the layman's terms, and we ask for it in like the most technical terms possible, because if we don't understand each of the small interactions, we're getting, and I get convincing your clients allow you to do investigation, it can be difficult. A lot of clients are saying, well, we're in the kind of impact I want my, form out of the media, go and something for us to all work together to interrogate, to make it good.
Yeah. So, because just like about last panel, the shift from ratings to impressions and minds. First, it's still constructed based on a lot of geographic orientation, and it kind of grew up. Well, you have national, and then you have DMAs and markets or CI, BDIs. But now, when you move into digital, especially with the top, you can really redefine and reconfigure television coverage in a whole new way. In theory, at some point, it'll be even global or international, because it's not confined to geography, particularly for Oscar, maybe a little bit you, Walt. Do you think more about how coverage and geography could be rethought in this program TV environment?
Yesterday in the roundtable, we kind of broke into a discussion about the targeting in platform. Like, well, we need demo and geo and things of that nature. And I'm like, as a digital guy, I'm like, oh yeah, I guess. I mean, I kind of want people who are my customers, and I want to know what they do and the behaviors, and not necessarily kind of the basics around geography. I mean, people buy stuff everywhere. People need to know about my products in a lot of places, and so geography is less of a concern to me. It's more about the consumer and where they are and the understanding of my clients' products and the life cycle than it is about where they are and their gender or age.
Yeah, I think when we move more into OTT and can have really true household addressability or device addressability at scale, I think that just becomes one of the other targeting dimensions, because there's just going to be a lot more flexibility in terms of, and a lot more precision in terms of targeting that way.
Ross, guys, thanks very much.
Great, thank you.
We're going to move to the next 45 minutes. Then we're